I'm James O'Brien, and this is hamstring stretching explained. So hamstring flexibility is important for several reasons. Not only is it important if you want to have some killer dance moves at the next wedding, but also it's real important if you want to be able to bend forward in the correct fashion. That is, bending forward through the hip rather than bending forward through the low back and thus blowing out your low back. Tight hamstrings are the main reason why people can't correctly bend forward. In fact, if I work with someone who has tight hamstrings, I can only get them through a certain range of motion before they start tipping their pelvis backwards and rounding like I'm doing right now. So it's literally impossible for them to bend forward correctly. So it's real important for those individuals, and they're typically men, but some women have really tight hamstrings too, but it's a little bit more common in men. It's very important that those individuals loosen up the hamstrings so that they can actually bend forward in the correct fashion. Otherwise, every time they're bending forward, they're actually over-rounding their back and they're harming it. And for those individuals, it's actually just better to squat down to pick up things, or if they do bend forward, just to do it through a short range of motion until they get flexible enough to be able to bend forward nicely through the hip. So let's talk about the role of the hamstrings and what they actually do in the body. So they flex the knee like this, but they also extend the hip. So in order to stretch the hamstrings, we would keep the knee straight and flex forward at the hip. Or another option would be to bend the knee some and then flex forward even more through the hip. By flexing even more forward through the hip, you'll generate stretch at the hip, but because the knees are bent, you've taken some stretch away there at the knee. So if I were to bend my knees even more, then I would have to actually bend even more forward through the hip to feel that stretch. As I create slack at one end, I'm creating tension at the other. A lot of the traditional hamstring stretches that I see, to include like the runner stretch like this, or the forward fold stretch with a straight knee like this, the problem is with those is that rather than just bending forward through the hip, about half that motion is coming from the lumbar spine. And as a result, that excessive motion through the lumbar spine and some through the thoracic spine, over time that can generate instabilities and thus lead to pain and spasms. So when you stretch your hamstrings, the number one rule is you want to maintain a straight, elongated spine with good core engagement. So something like this here versus that. Here I feel just as great of a stretch, if not better, in my hamstring than I do actually when I'm here. And of course, the former is actually better for my back. This goes for all stretching, but I would say the best time to stretch is when you're really warmed up. Ideally, you would do some form of myofascial release first, foam rolling, use a lacrosse ball, some self-massage, then do some type of working out, whether it's aerobic or strength training or some of these therapeutic exercises, whatever, to warm the muscle up. And then when the muscle is, all the kinks are worked out from the self-myofascial release, the muscles are nice and warm and pliable, that's the best time to stretch. Muscles can be stretched either statically, meaning that we get into a position and we stay there for a prolonged period of time, or dynamically, meaning that we move in and out of the stretch, or we create the stretch and then back off. This would be a dynamic stretch. Moving back and forth here, that's a dynamic stretch. If I were just to put my foot up there like this and stay there, that would be a static stretch. When doing any form of static stretching, the typical rule is to stretch in total for approximately 2 minutes. With regards to dynamic stretches, I don't know. I just do about like 30 seconds to a minute, I guess. But I like to do a variety of everything, and it seems that seems to be the most effective. Getting back to the hamstrings, to stretch the upper hamstring, you'd have more knee bend, but more flexion at the hip. To stretch the lower hamstring, you would have the knee straight and less flexion at the hip. To stretch the inner hamstring, my hip would be adducted, and I could bend forward like this. So as I'm bending forward through the hip here, I feel more of an inner hamstring stretch. Or the other option would be to externally rotate some and then bend forward. If I were to stretch my outer hamstring, what I would do is I would come across. So if I were to come across like this and then bend forward through the hip, now I feel more of a stretch on my outer hamstring. The amount of ankle dorsiflexion you have can also affect the stretch. So this motion, as I pull my foot up towards me here, this is called ankle dorsiflexion. So if I'm in a hamstring stretched position like I am right now, if I pull my toe up towards me, I feel a huge stretch. And really what's happening there is I'm doing really one or two things. I'm stretching the fascia, which is everything that connects us together, that holds all the muscles in place so things just don't flop around. But more than likely, I'm stretching the nerve, okay? In this case, it would be the sciatic nerve. And if I'm getting a sharp stretch like this, I want to avoid it. So I'd be better off to allow my foot to go where it wants to go so I get a nice hamstring stretch and not that sharp nervy stretch. Because if you're getting that sharp nervy stretch, you might be overstretching the nerve, and as a result, it could lead to some sciatica symptoms. On the website, there are 7 different hamstring stretches with videos and instructions. So 2 of those are more or less static stretches, and the other 5 are dynamic stretches. And really, you can take any of the stretches and make them into either static or dynamic stretches. I would say the best way to really augment your hamstring flexibility is to really do a variety of stretches, as well as doing some of the self-myofascial release and then trying to strengthen through a full range of motion. And really those dynamic stretches, in a way, are strengthening through that full range of motion because that is training you on your newfound range of motion. And as your brain discovers how to control that newfound range of motion, you'll actually maintain it better.